This is a story about coming to know my animal body from the inside, from the fibres of my muscles, from the immediacy of my senses, about really knowing that in a kind of tactile, embodied, tangible way. It's also a story about how our primate heritage lives on in us, how our evolution is there, how it's part of us, part of everything that we are, even though we're not aware of it a lot of the time. I was 24 years old and I was living in Tanzania doing research for a PhD in anthropology. I was working with people called the Tutog who herd cattle, goat and sheep in really quite a remote area that's in between many of Tanzania's national parks. The area where the Tutog live, there has a lot of wildlife, but in the immediate vicinity of Tutog homesteads, it's quite shy and you don't see it very much, but you see a lot of tracks and you hear it. At night, you hear the calls. That area's classic East African bush. So there's scrubland of brambles and shrubs and acacia trees kind of interspersed with grass. And then there's some areas that are much more open areas of pasture. And then some areas of woodland. When this particular story happened, I was quite near the beginning of my research and I'd been based in a village, but I was meeting people and I'd been invited to go to this village that was quite some distance away. So we were going to go for a couple of days really to meet a new different group of people, have a look around, get a sense for the place, the environment. I was very keen to explore. I was being helped in my research by a young Tutog man called Momoya, incredibly bright young man who was just invaluable to the project. And because it was going to take a long time to get to this other village, Momoya and I set off quite early for this journey. The first leg we could drive. There's no roads down where the Tutog are, but there were some cattle trails that we could follow, albeit very slowly. It took us about 3 hours to go 20 miles. But we got to the place where the trails ran out. There was just no more way of driving. So we parked the Land Rover and at that point packed up small backpacks with what I was going to need for an overnight stay. So drinking water and anti-malarial medicine, a small medical kit, a mosquito net, my toothbrush and toothpaste of course, notepad, pens, camera, film, that kind of thing. Momoya, also being a young Tutog man, he had his spear and his staff, and we walked off into the bush. There were still a few signs of Tutog at that stage. There'd be the odd young man herding, the cattle and some kind of older kids herding goats and sheep, but not a lot. We were definitely kind of heading off into what to me felt like nowhere, absolute wilderness. By the time we'd actually started walking, it was late morning and it was the middle of the dry season and it was baking hot. The sun was overhead, it was baking hot. Every bit of moisture evaporated, so my mouth ended up drier than it had ever been, and my eyes were itching, and the membranes of my nostrils felt like they were cracking up. My sweat evaporated practically instantly, but it kind of, as it did so, melded with the dust, and so I was kind of, before long, covered with this kind of greyish brown second skin. It was pretty tough going. I was pretty aware of my body because it was so uncomfortable. After walking for about an hour or so, we came to a river that we needed to cross. It was wide, it was full of sediment. I had no idea how deep it was. Momoya, who'd crossed it before, said that in the dry season it wasn't going to be that deep and it'd be absolutely fine. We'd be, it'd be cool to cross. We sort of tentatively, all the same, pretty tentatively stepped into the flowing water. It came about up to our waists, and in the heat, it was just glorious. It was so cool and so refreshing. To feel all that dust just washing away, even temporarily, was just glorious. In fact, it felt so good that I took my backpack off and dunked down underneath up to my shoulders just to get as much of me under the water as possible, just for that momentary relief. When we came out the other side of the river, we entered an area of really open grassland, of pasture land. And at that point, we started seeing And there was no sign of any tautog anywhere. This was clearly somewhere where they weren't, I don't know, using at that time. And that was when we started seeing more wildlife. That said, the first thing that I noticed was this lattice work of snake tracks that were carved into a kind of dry, dusty patch of earth. Snakes are going to try and avoid humans, but there are 3 species down there that are highly venomous. Puff adders, black mambas and spitting cobras, and they'll kill a human being if they bite. And at that point I started thinking that this whole trip might be a little bit unwise. I mean, we were probably 2 hours from the Land Rover at that stage. We didn't have radios. It was years before mobile phones had been invented. You know, and I was wondering, if either Momoy or I got bitten by a snake, what were we going to do? I'm absolutely clueless and quite worried about it. Anyway, my fears didn't last long because they kind of got swept away, because not long afterwards we saw this family of bat-eared foxes. They're normally nocturnal, so to see them out during the day was really extraordinary. There was an adult and 3 young, and they're one of my favourite species. They're really cute. They've got these pixie-like faces. They're tannin coloured. They've got black legs and a black stripe down their tail. And as their name suggests, they've got these oversized ears, which they use to lose heat from when it's really hot. And they also use them to locate, they hunt insects. They eat a lot of insects and they use them to listen for insects. Apparently their hearing's so good that they can hear insects underground. Anyway, this family, they were, you know, we were downwind of them, they couldn't smell us, and they were focused on the ground looking for insects, so they didn't see us either. And they kind of trotted happily towards us for quite a long way. When they did eventually see us, they stopped dead and kind of statue-like, and then charged off as fast as they could into the distance. But it was just wonderful to see them. They're really wonderful, wonderful kind of creatures. And not long after that, we started seeing small groups of zebra and wildebeest and their young grazing. And there was a giraffe that stood tall with her calf. I'd loved all these animals when I was a child. I had a painting of them on my bedroom wall when I was a child. And I'd loved the stories and all that kind of thing. They'd just been kind of magical world to me. And when I got to Tanzania, very early on, I'd gone to the Serengeti National Park to see them in the flesh. But then I'd been in a Land Rover and I'd been separated from the animals by glass and by metal, and I'd been sat up and slightly looking down on them. Now it was entirely different. I was walking through the land that they were living in. My feet were treading on earth that their hooves might well have trodden on. And I was living with people who lived in that environment, the same environment that they lived with. I was part of that system, part of that environment. And it was just awe-inspiring. It was utterly, utterly magical to feel it in that way, feel myself part of it in that way. And that awe and the wonder stayed with me all the way through the grassland as we kept seeing, you know, these creatures. However, after a while we got to some woodland that we needed to cross. There was this band of woodland, and at that point my awe cartwheeled into fear. When we were out on the grassland, we could see for miles. It was dry season, also the grass was really pretty low. So had there been any threatening animals, had there been any dangers, we'd have been able to spot it from miles away. Once we got into the woodland, it was an entirely different story. We could barely see 6 feet on either side of us. Momoy gripped his spear more tightly, and I saw the muscles in his forearms tense. He turned to me and said that now we had to be quiet. We had to be really focused on looking out for animals. And he was particularly concerned about small groups of buffalo that have a propensity to charge humans and are actually responsible for more human deaths in East Africa than a lot of other species, a surprising number. And of course he was also concerned about leopards and lions. Modern humans aren't a first choice of a meal for a leopard or a lion. They've learnt that we've got weapons these days, they've learnt to avoid us, they've learnt that we're dangerous. But attacks do still happen. People are killed every year in Tanzania in East Africa by lions. And Momoya actually warned me that one of his friends had been killed in this very woodland by a lioness fairly recently. The alarm that I felt at Momoya's warning, I think, came together, got exacerbated, got amplified by a deep knowing that our ancestors, humans that had lived generations before us, early humans, some of the earliest members of our species, and indeed the species that came before us, were absolutely prey for some of the African large cats. Some of them, we think, actually specialised on hunting some of our ancestral species. Throughout most of our evolutionary history, we've been the hunted as well as the hunter. And I think we all have some kind of embodied knowledge of that, an embodied knowing of that. So this kind of ancient fear just engulfed me and swept through me. My mouth, which was already dry, became drier still. My stomach contracted into this kind of writhing knot of steel. My cells started to vibrate as though they'd been plugged into a source of electricity. Everything was on guard. The problem was, my body didn't know what to look out for. Humans are fantastic at learning. We live in so many different environments that we have to learn how to make a living, how to find food, and what's dangerous in that environment when we grow up. But I'd grown up in central London, so I'd never learnt what was dangerous in the East African bush. I hadn't learnt the signals that were going to mean that there was something threatening happening in the East African bush. And my body, pretty much of its own accord, decided that it was going to copy Momoya. So whenever he hesitated, I froze. Whenever he relaxed, I took a step forward. It was as though an ancient survival system had got control of my muscles and was playing this kind of life and death version of grandmother's footsteps. That ancient survival system also seized control of my mind, in that all thoughts disappeared and all there was my senses. So touch came to the forefront of my awareness, because every time I was about to put my foot down, I'd just feel the ground underneath my foot, just to check that it was solid, that I wasn't about to step on a snake. My nostrils felt like they were trying to flare open and sniff out any scents of animals. They didn't know what an animal's scent was, or the scent of dangerous animals was, but they were still going to be looking for any changes in scent, anything that might just indicate an animal was nearby. My ears actively listened for grunts, for growls, and also just for movement through the vegetation. And of course, my eyes were scanning everywhere. They were going from left to right to left to right, looking for coats and fur of animals, looking for a twitching tail or an ear that moved. I was also looking out for any trees that I might be able to climb. And I'd keep kind of a count of them. So there'd be, well, if something charges us from the left, that's the closest tree on the right that I'm capable of climbing. And if something comes at us from the right, that's the closest tree on the left. And I'd keep track of all these trees. This kind of ancient fear and the immediacy that went with it filled me and framed me. And I experienced myself in a more stripped down and naked way than I had ever done before. I was a primate. I was a two-legged, a bipedal primate that actually couldn't run that fast through that kind of dense woodland. Certainly not fast enough to outrun a charging buffalo or a lion that was going to have a sprint and a hunt. I was a ground-dwelling primate, so although there were a few trees that I was capable of climbing, there weren't many, and I was going to be pretty slow and cumbersome at climbing trees. It was going to be pretty difficult for me to get out of the way of danger by climbing a tree. I was a primate that wasn't particularly strong. Gorillas and chimpanzees are much stronger than us. But once we started to use tools and develop weapons, we lost some of the strength in our body because we could use these tools and the weapons to defend ourselves. And although Momoya had a spear, I didn't have a weapon, and I wouldn't have had a clue how to use one, even if I'd had one. Most of all, I was a group-living primate, a primate who'd got most of their safety, their security, from being in a reasonably sized group. And yet here I was with just one other person. I was a human primate in a situation that had been potentially life-threatening for practically as long as our species has existed. Of course, as this ancient fear framed me and filled me, none of that was going through my mind. I wasn't having those kind of thoughts. In the kind of rawness of the fear, there was only my senses, the immediacy of my surrounding environment, and every step that I was taking. But once we came out of the woodland and got a little bit of distance from it, and then we started seeing the Totogue village that we were going to visit, not that far away, and we'd see houses and again, herds of cattle, young men with cattle, started seeing people. The fear started to ebb away. And it was at that point that I realised that for the previous hour, I had been in my primate body, and I had been only my primate body. There had been absolutely nothing else about me that had mattered.